Welcome to the channel where powerful stories come to life. Get ready for truth, emotion, and transformation, one story at a time. Have you ever been looked down on just because you seemed fragile? Ever been discarded before even trying, as if your body said it all and your soul meant nothing? Then listen closely, because this story is for those tired of being invisible, for those who feel in their very skin the weight of disregard, yet still carry in their hearts a dream that no one sees. They laughed at him, said he wouldn't last a second on the court, treated him like just another skinny kid with no shot. But what no one knew was that he trained in the dark so he could shine when the time was right. And when the world mocked him, he answered with the only sound that silences laughter, the swish of the ball through the net and the scoreboard flipping. This isn't just another story of overcoming. It's a silent scream that turned into thunder. It's about lonely practices, an unlikely mentor, and a game that made the whole crowd rise to their feet, not just for what he did, but for who he became. And if you think this story ends with victory, you're wrong, because what came next was even greater. So get ready, because after hearing this, you may never see yourself the same way again. At Shai's school, the basketball court was more than a sports arena. It was a social stage. Whoever stood out there, stood out in the hallways, gained status, respect, social media followers, even party invites. It was as if the three-point line also marked who deserved attention and who should remain invisible. And in that world of muscles, loud voices, and rehearsed poses, Shai didn't fit. His skinny, almost frail body was a constant target of jokes. Need the wind to carry you to the hoop? They mocked. Laughter came easy for them. But for him, it was like carrying the weight of a world determined to say he didn't belong. Shai walked with short, almost discreet steps. It wasn't shame. It was strategy. He avoided drawing attention, like someone who learned early that every spotlight came with humiliation. During tryouts, this reality hit hard. Before even touching the ball, he could feel judging eyes piercing him like thorns. The coach, a man with a booming voice and puffed-up chest, barely hid his disdain. "You'll break on the first hit, kid," he scoffed, sparking laughter among the players. That sentence could have been just another in a long line, but for Shai, it struck differently. It wasn't the insult that silenced him. It was his choice not to prove anything right then and there. Because while they laughed, he felt something they couldn't see. His soul, unlike his body, stood tall. And that's something many don't understand. Not all strength is loud. Some feed on silence. While others trained for instant performance, Shai observed. Not with envy, but with focus. He saw who forced shots, who marked poorly, who got lost in their ego. He was learning without touching the ball. And that, my friend, is a rare skill. The ability to listen deeply to the game. Not just with ears, but with eyes, with instincts, with a body that, though thin, carried a raw will to grow. But make no mistake, the disregard didn't only come from the court. It was in the whispers at lunch, in the lack of invites, in PE class where Shai was always picked last. That kind of quiet, everyday rejection crushes dreams with the force of a punch. But Shai made a choice that few can, not to let others' vision define his own future, and that became his shield. Here's the truth. When someone is labeled as too fragile, their body often starts believing it. They shrink more, risk less. But Shai did the opposite. Instead of shrinking, he began to rebuild, away from watchful eyes. Mockery became his fuel. The bench they left him on became his lab. Every time someone said, "You're not built for this," he responded with silence. And another secret practice under the night sky. It was as if each humiliation pushed him 1 inch closer to excellence. And that's one of the powerful truths many stories reveal. Those who start strong don't always finish big. What sustains a journey isn't a stereotype, it's consistency. And Shai began developing a strength the world rarely praises, the strength of intention. He didn't just want to make the team. He wanted to own the game, understand its essence, go beyond the physical, and turn disadvantage into strategy. And that, my friend, can't be measured with a tape. Days went by, and while others tired themselves in flashy training sessions, Shai worked in the shadows. Not from lack of desire to be center stage, but by choice. Because he understood early that rushing to be seen often delays growth, and as painful as it was to watch his peers get medals and likes, he chose the quiet path. He chose refinement over instant shine, chose cold nights with worn-out shoes over selfies in new uniforms. chose to build even without a spotlight. But what was most impressive was that Shai never lost respect. Not for those who mocked him, not for the game, not for himself. And that, my friend, is nobility. He didn't carry anger but motivation, because deep down he knew that one day that body they called too fragile would be the same to lift an entire court, that those mocking eyes would be the ones to be amazed, and that the story the world ignored was, in truth, a growing seed. It just needed time, not applause. There's a quote that says, "Never underestimate the quiet ones. Sometimes it's in silence that the world is changing." And Shai was living proof. While they mocked, he studied. While they ignored him, he improved. While the world rushed, he planted roots. And when it all bloomed, oh, no coach, no player, no rule could hold back that skinny kid. Because what Shai carried wasn't just the desire to play. It was the desire to transform, to prove that appearance is never an argument to limit anyone, and to show, with sweat and humility, that the best stories are born from the worst expectations. The kid they said would break on the first hit was about to show he wouldn't just endure the impact, he'd strike back with talent, focus, and game vision. That day, Shai was training alone, just as he had been since being rejected by the school team. The ball was worn out, his shoes barely had soles left, and his uniform was a mix of pieces he had sewn together to resemble a set. But there was something that stood out. He moved with the seriousness of someone playing in a championship final. Each shot was followed by deep breaths, posture adjustments, and relentless repetition. It was as if no one saw him, except for Ramon, standing silently on the other side of the fence, watching attentively, without saying a word. The next day, he was there again. Same cap, same gaze, same silence. Then, after 3 days of observing, Ramon approached. He didn't ask Shai's name. He just looked at his feet, pointed to his stance, and said, "If you keep that up, you'll always miss to the left." Then he walked away. That's how it began. No introductions, no promises, no certificates. Just a technical comment that hit the mark. Shai didn't react with suspicion. He smiled, because deep down, he knew that was the beginning of something bigger. In the days that followed, Ramon returned frequently. He sat on the same concrete bench, sometimes with a water bottle, other times with just his focused gaze. He started correcting small movements, then moved on to fundamentals. He spoke little, but each word felt like a new chapter in a book Shai hadn't realized he was reading. "The body plays what the mind believes," he would say. "Don't train until you get it right. Train until you can't get it wrong." Simple phrases, but filled with experience, the kind only someone who's lived many stories can share. But what was most impressive wasn't Ramon's technique, it was how he taught. He didn't yell, didn't demand, didn't care to be acknowledged. It was as if he was giving back something life had once given him, and maybe that's exactly what it was. Shai, on the other hand, wasn't your typical teenager. He didn't talk back, didn't joke around, didn't roll his eyes. He listened carefully, mentally noted every detail, and applied it in practice the next day. Their connection wasn't built on words. It was built on mutual respect. It was one of those afternoons when Ramon shared part of his own story. He said he had once been a player, not a national star but a court warrior, one of those who left their heart in every game. He played for small teams, lived in windowless dorms, and endured hardship trying to land a contract that never came. He sat on the bench more often than he played, but never stopped training as if he were about to enter the championship final. "If you want to be remembered, you must first earn the dignity of being ignored," he said as he adjusted his cap. With time, Ramon started bringing practical elements to the training. He improvised cones with plastic bottles, drew plays in the dirt with dry sticks, taught Shai to read his opponent before the tip-off. More than technical gestures, he showed how to position oneself in life. "The world will laugh at you until it can't ignore your name anymore," he'd say. "But when they laugh, keep going. Every laugh you swallow today turns into applause tomorrow." Words like these don't come from books, they come from stories lived with scars and silence. And with those lessons, Shai's posture began to change, not just in the game, but in how he walked, looked, and reacted. Before, he lowered his head when he made a mistake. Now he fixed his breathing, adjusted his shoulders, and tried again. He began to believe in himself differently, not with arrogance, but with awareness. The awareness of someone being shaped by a man who no longer needed to prove anything, only to pass on what he had learned the hard way. As the weeks went by, The training sessions intensified. Even without a proper court, a new hoop, or a real uniform, the two of them created an environment of excellence. Ramon would say, "Don't wait for the ideal setup, build the ideal mindset." And Shai internalized that more each day. When it rained, they trained under the school's awnings. When there was no basketball, they used a tennis ball. Nothing stopped them, because one mind had already understood the value of persistence, and the other heart was set on planting a legacy. Interestingly, no one at school knew who Ramon was. They thought he was just another lonely old man strolling through the park. But behind that weary walk was a former athlete who could spot raw talent. And he would say, "You don't need to be famous to change a life. You just need to be available." And that's exactly what he did. He didn't seek attention or gratitude. He simply offered what he had: experience, patience, and faith. Faith in a boy everyone had discarded, except him. Months passed and Shai's growth became evident, not just in his movements but in his maturity. He was no longer shaken by criticism, nor excited by empty praise. He learned to listen more, observe the entire game, and understand that patience is more valuable than talent. And he repeated this to himself like a mantra: play like it's your last game, train like it's your first. Ramon's words, one of many that became part of his identity. And so, without fanfare or spotlights, one of the most beautiful stories began. An invisible boy found an unexpected mentor. A forgotten man rekindled the light of what he once believed was lost. Because in the end, life has this extraordinary gift of bringing together unlikely paths to create powerful destinies. And that's why we should never underestimate a silent presence, a casual comment, or a quiet helping hand. Sometimes those are the things that change everything. When the school tournament poster went up on the gym wall, the popular players' eyes lit up. It was a chance to shine, to be seen by scouts, to be cheered by the whole school. But among the most talked about names, one wasn't even mentioned: Shai. Skinny, quiet, always wearing a jersey too big for his body. He was the type you'd overlook, even if he stood right in front of you. He sat on the bench like someone who had accepted his role as a background character. He didn't protest, didn't beg for playing time. He trained, but trained in the dark, as if each solo dribble was a pact with a future that had no set date. And it was in that silence that he grew. While the starters made dunk videos on Instagram, Shai stacked bricks in his backyard and shot until his arms went numb. No one saw, no one knew. But each lonely training session was a story, written in sweat, while the world was distracted by the spotlight. Destiny, however, has its own way of rewriting narratives. And when a series of injuries shook the starting lineup, the coach found himself out of options. He needed someone. He didn't want Shai, but he called him, not with hope, with resignation, as if saying, "Just don't mess things up." Shai heard his name, but not the tone. He laced up his shoes with the confidence of someone who knew this moment wasn't a gift. It was a harvest. His teammates laughed, joked, asked if he was just going to get a closer view. But he stepped onto the court, and he did so with the eyes of someone who had already lived that game 1,000 times. In dreams, in training, in the days when the world seemed deaf to his effort. While others sweated nervously, he breathed calmly. While the crowd yawned at his entrance, he read the court like a secret map. Because those who train in the dark learn to see beyond the light. His first touches still sparked laughter. A clumsy dribble here, a slight hesitation there. "Here comes the lamppost," some whispered cruelly, thinking the nickname would stick. But one perfect pass leading to a basket, followed by 2 flawless three-pointers, changed everything. The noise in the gym turned into stunned silence. The sound from the bleachers seemed to hide itself. With each well-executed play, Shai shattered an expectation. With each assist, he dismantled a prejudice. And it wasn't just the scoreboard that flipped. It was perception. Suddenly, teammates sought him in plays. The ball, which once avoided him, now gravitated toward him. That's when the magic began. And it wasn't magic by chance, but by consequence. Because the stories that truly inspire aren't born from luck. They come from preparation. While others complained about practice, he was putting in extra hours with his own shadow. When the school slept, he trained. When self-esteem wavered, he watched videos of Kobe and Nash, mimicking their moves until they became second nature. And on that court, in front of a crowd that had always ignored him, it all came pouring out, like a dam bursting after years of holding back a river of talent. From benchwarmer to protagonist, Shai made a transition that few ever witness in a lifetime. It wasn't just about flashy moves. It was about game intelligence. He knew where to be, when to speed up, when to slow down, how to read opponents like open books. His confidence didn't skyrocket, it rooted itself, solid, unshakable. Each play carried a message. I've always been here. You just never looked. And slowly, the gym gave in. The taunts of lamppost turned into applause. The mocking stares became admiration. Even his opponents began marking him more seriously. And even then, he found the gaps. It was no longer just a game. It was a lesson, a moving manifesto. The entire school began to cheer for him, not out of pity but out of respect, because there stood someone who proved with every possession that stories aren't built on applause. They're built on persistence, on the courage to keep going even when no one's watching. That's when the coach, the same one who only called him up out of obligation, started to see something different. From the sidelines, his eyes searched for Shai before every play. The forgotten boy had become a reference, but the climax was still to come, the final scene of this chapter, because great storylines know how to hold the decisive moment. The game was close. The starters, exhausted, looked to Shai for direction, and he, with the same calm of someone who spent a lifetime being underestimated, took responsibility. The ball burned in others' hands, but in his, it was an extension of his body. He began dictating the pace, controlling the clock like a conductor with an invisible baton. In minutes, he became the team's emotional thermometer, and when he hit the third three-pointer in a row, the crowd erupted. In that moment, the world felt fairer, as if the universe was apologizing for ignoring him for so long. But the truth is, it wasn't the world that changed. It was him who never gave up. And that's the hidden lesson in great stories. Those who persist in the shadows eventually become impossible to ignore. Shai's pale face now stood under the spotlight, but none of it dazzled him. He knew this wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Because true transformation isn't fame. It's recognizing your own worth, even when no one else does. The game ended. The win was celebrated, but the real victory ran deeper. Because that day, it wasn't just a boy who shone. It was an entire system of rushed judgment that got challenged. A culture of appearances that was put in check. And that doesn't fade when the gym lights go out, that echoes, it becomes legend, inspiration. New stories that will be told in other schools, in other cities, by other boys who once thought they weren't good enough because of their body, their silence, or their shyness. The score was tight, the clock relentless, and the looks? Most didn't even notice Shai sitting there on the bench with a wrinkled uniform and shoulders more slumped than usual. Just another school game. But for him, it was everything. An improvised stage where maybe, just maybe, he could prove he belonged there not just as a placeholder, but no one expected anything. Not the coach, not the teammates, not even the opponents. After all, it was just Shai, that skinny, quiet kid who always kept his head down. But epic stories often start out of nowhere, and it was there, in the final quarter, that fate began to turn the page. Less than 4 minutes remained. The team trailed by 9 points. That's when one of the starters twisted his ankle and couldn't go on. The coach, with few options, looked to the end of the bench and said, almost reluctantly, "Shai, you're in. No expectations, no instructions, just a sigh." But he stood up like someone who'd been waiting for that moment his entire life. Worn-out shoes, sweaty hands, and one thought in mind, it's now or never. The silence that had followed him for months turned into total focus, and the first play changed everything. He received the ball from the point guard, looked around, and shot. A three-pointer. The ball sliced through the air like an arrow and dropped cleanly into the basket. 3 points. The bench still didn't react. But on the next play, he anticipated a pass, stole the ball at midcourt, and with the poise of a veteran made the layup. 2 more. Now just 4 behind. Teammates exchanged glances. Was it coincidence? Luck? No. It was the beginning of a story no one had foreseen, except him. The next possession came as a test. He moved without the ball, received it in the corner, spun with agility, and another three-pointer. The gym, which had once laughed mockingly, was filled with murmurs of surprise. The other team called a timeout. Their coach shouted, flustered. But on Shai's side, no one said a word, just stunned looks. And there he was, back on court, the same focused face, as if it were just another night in his backyard, with the rusty hoop and bricks as obstacles. Because this wasn't raw talent. It was repetition, resilience, and a hunger you don't teach in training. The hunger to change your own story. He scored 18 points in a row, alone. No one could believe it, not even his teammates who at first rushed to help, but quickly realized it was better to let him lead. And the most impressive thing wasn't just the points, but how he scored them. Each move was clean, sharp, surgical. While opponents fumbled from nerves, Shai operated on another frequency. It was as if time slowed down just for him. He watched the clock, adjusted his breath, read the defense, and executed. No hesitation, no fear, just one certainty. He wouldn't leave without making his mark. And when that final shot came, the entire gym went silent. 3 seconds on the clock. He received the ball, dribbled once, stepped back, and shot. The ball rose, dancing in the air, then dropped. Swish. 3 points. Victory. The crowd exploded. The bench stormed the court. But no one ran to the veterans. Everyone ran to him. The invisible kid was now the center of it all. Hugs, backpats, chants of beast and legend filled the court. The coach, frozen on the sideline, swallowed hard, speechless, and Shai just took a deep breath, like someone who had played out that moment in his mind 1,000 times. The most symbolic part came after. He didn't celebrate wildly. No yelling, no dance. He just lifted his head, for the first time in a long while, and looked into his teammates' eyes. No arrogance, just gratitude. Gratitude for finally having the space to write his own story. And in that instant, something shifted in everyone there. The subtle prejudice, the quiet jokes, the hidden snickers. All of it crumbled under the truth. Shai wasn't a fluke. He was the result of someone who never gave up, even when ignored. At the post-game interview, a school newspaper reporter asked, "What went through your mind on that final shot?" He paused a moment, then answered simply, "I just did what I always did when no one was watching." That line made headlines, not for boldness, but for the raw truth it carried. How many other Shais were out there, training in silence, waiting for a chance? The answer echoed through the bleachers. Because what that game proved is that stories of perseverance don't need a spotlight to be born. Just a crack, an opening, an opportunity. The video begins with a shaky, tilted frame, filmed on a random phone. But what it captures needs no filter or professional editing. Shai, the skinny kid who didn't even have a proper uniform, dribbles past 3 defenders and lays it in with stunning finesse. The camera shakes with excitement, screams, jumps, swear words in disbelief. The improvised narration, done by a classmate who didn't even know much about basketball, went viral like wildfire. "It's the invisible kid. Look at that. He's a hero now," the student shouted, voice breaking with disbelief and pride. And that was enough. That once silent court, where Shai spent his breaks training alone, became a headline. The ignored boy who became a headline. Invisible? Not anymore. Or From Bench to Legend Meet Shai were some of the titles that flooded sports sites, Instagram pages, YouTube channels, and WhatsApp groups. The boy once mocked for his frail frame now received likes, shares, and hearts. Because yes, it's curious how the same society that silences stories at the start loves to applaud them when the ending is beautiful. But Shai didn't get carried away. It was a whirlwind. Radio interviews, calls from sports shows asking him to appear live, messages from influencers raving about his highlights as if they'd discovered the next big star. His name, once absent from game sheets, now trended online. But what truly made his heart race wasn't the hype. It was what arrived quietly in his inbox. It was an email. One of those you think is fake, that looks like spam because it's too surreal. Kentucky, UCLA, Duke, universities with a century-old basketball tradition offering full scholarships to a boy who, weeks ago, wasn't even a starter on his school team. "We saw your video. We loved your energy. We want you with us." Shai read it, reread it, showed it to his mom, to Coach Ramon. He cried, because at that moment he realized, when you train in the dark, you build a light that no artificial spotlight can replicate. And that light, when it shines, doesn't need permission to glow. Despite all the buzz around his name, Shai kept his feet firmly on the ground. He continued training with Ramon, who now smiled like someone watching a sun soar. And the most beautiful part? It was the same training, same rhythm, Same silence. The difference was that now the world was watching. But unlike so many who change when the spotlight hits, Shai knew the true value of a story isn't in the number of views, but in the journey taken to get there. He declined invitations to shows that wanted to turn him into a meme, said no to advertising offers that required him to change his style or persona. He kept helping his mother at home, going to classes, respecting the cycle of someone who knew he still had much to live. Fame didn't corrupt him. It only illuminated what was already strong: his discipline, his resilience, his identity, because fame is fire. It can either warm you or burn you, and he chose to use it as a lighthouse, not a bonfire. But maybe the most important part of this new phase wasn't the scholarship, nor the followers, nor the autographs he started signing outside school. It was something deeper, something he only realized after giving a talk, still shy, at an underprivileged school. He spoke about his childhood, the shame, the feeling of not being seen, and at the end, a girl hugged him tightly and said, "I thought it was just me. Thank you for existing." That's when Shai understood. His story was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who had ever been ignored, judged by their body, underestimated because of their silence. It belonged to every boy who trains on the asphalt in flip-flops, every girl who's told, "This isn't for you." And that's why he started saying in every interview, "I'm not a miracle. I'm just proof that persistence hurts, but it works." The game revealed his talent, but pain revealed his purpose. As his story spread, it became fuel for others. Youth teams in other states started referencing his name as a symbol of perseverance. Teachers used his journey in motivational classes. The video of his clutch play became study material in sports media and storytelling courses. Even former classmates who once ignored him began reposting his content with pride, some with shame, it's true, but all acknowledging they had been wrong. Shai, with all his serenity, held no grudges, but he didn't forget either. He knew that the early phase, when no one bet a dime on him, was the ground where he planted his strength, and when asked what it felt like to be recognized on the streets, he would smile and say, "I'm still the same. It's just that now, you see me." What's most impressive is that Shai never expected recognition. He just didn't give up, and that's why his story moves people. Because it's not about magic. It's about consistency, about waking up early when no one's watching, about sweating alone on the court, about failing 1,000 times and trying for the 1,001st. And this turning point shows us the power we have to write a new chapter, even when the beginning was scribbled out by other people's hands. The room was packed, chairs aligned, cameras rolling, reporters jotting down every move. It was just another school press conference, but no one there knew they were about to witness something far greater than a sports update. The coach, usually confident and authoritative, stood up with papers in hand, but unlike other times, he didn't start with numbers or stats. He began with a sigh, long, almost like asking for a timeout. His voice didn't come out as usual. It was shaky, hesitant, as if every word carried the weight of an unspoken mistake. And it did. "Before any announcements, I need to speak as a human being. I misjudged." The room froze. Phones stopped typing. All eyes turned to him. "I confused silence with weakness, a frail body with lack of talent, and maybe the worst, I confused my own limitations with his. I was terribly wrong about you, Shai." In that moment, the air seemed heavier. The journalists, used to prepped answers, glanced at each other. Some sighed. Others swallowed hard. Because it's not common to see a coach publicly admit he failed, especially not on camera, especially not in front of a boy who, months before, had been humiliated and dismissed. Shai, sitting in the second row, kept his eyes steady. There was no vanity in his expression. No pride, no revenge, just serenity. The same serenity with which he used to train with bricks when he had no weights. The same with which he heard all those past no's without letting them turn into open wounds. When they offered him the microphone, he held it with both hands, took a deep breath and said, "I don't hold a grudge, I just wanted to play. Nothing more. No accusations, no jabs, no sarcasm." And that's exactly why everyone fell silent. Because true forgiveness disarms even the most skeptical. And right there, in that school gym, a boy who was once invisible made the world understand something simple, yet powerful. Greatness isn't measured by how many points you score, but by how you respond to injustice. The press conference ended without questions. It didn't need any. The answers were already there, in that moment. But the ripple effects didn't stop at the court's edge. The school, once rigid in its criteria, began to rethink its selection processes. The question that used to be, who's the strongest, became, who has the most willingness to learn? And that changed everything. Teachers who once only saw numbers on report cards began to notice the nuances. Students' eyes, quiet absences, timid questions that revealed courage. They started calling students by name, not just by ID number. They started caring more about effort than performance. And the classmates? Something changed there too. The silent arrogance of many gave way to curiosity. People who had never said a word to Shai started greeting him in the hallway, making small talk during breaks, asking how his weekend training went, not because he had become a star, but because they had finally seen who he really was. One of them, a mirror. And Shai, almost without realizing it, began to occupy a new place. No longer the bench, but the heart of a revolution, because his story, built on humility and silence, began to touch others. Young people who had also been ignored, who had talent hidden under fear, who had strength disguised as shyness. They began to see themselves in Shai, began to try again, to ask to join tryouts, to train after hours, to believe that maybe they could write their stories too. That's when Shai understood. What he carried wasn't just a ball, it was a purpose. And that purpose was bigger than any medal. He didn't want to be remembered just as the boy who won despite everything. He wanted to be remembered as the one who paved the way for others to win too. And you could see it in the little things. When a new student asked for shooting tips, Shai didn't just answer. He stayed late to help. When another kid was mocked for being too skinny, Shai was the first to say, "They said that about me too, but look where I am now." And those moments, seemingly small, started forming a chain. A quiet, powerful chain. One that began to take over the school, the team, the whole community. Upon witnessing the impact he had made, the school board decided to launch a new sports mentorship program, led by senior students who had once faced exclusion and overcame it. Shai was the first name that came to mind, and he accepted immediately, not because he craved recognition, but because he understood. Stories need continuity, and now he was one of the guardians of those stories. Over time, his words became a reference, his actions, an example, and his name, once ignored on the tryout list, became a symbol etched on the school's walls. Shai, where rejection ended, resilience began. That phrase now decorated the gym's mural, but Shai knew the greatest victory wasn't on the wall. It was in the seeds he was planting, ones that would blossom for generations to come. Because when a young person forgives, they don't just transform their own pain, they free others from ignorance. When they respond to injustice with work, they show that character is worth more than a resume. When they persist, even without applause, they teach that stories don't have to be grand to be unforgettable. They just have to be real. And so the school that once excluded him now embraced him as a role model. The teachers who once overlooked him now invited him to speak. And the coach? Well, he became one of the region's strongest advocates for inclusion in school sports. All because one day he had the courage to say, "I was so wrong about you." And because on the other side, he found someone with enough greatness to reply, "I just wanted to play." Shai's story, which began with bricks instead of dumbbells, took flight in ways he never expected. The scrawny kid who was once benched because of his appearance now traveled across cities, auditoriums, and hearts, carrying a message that went beyond sports. He never sought the spotlight, but the spotlight found him, because his journey struck a nerve where so many others begin, the pain of being invisible. And in every place he spoke, he found versions of his younger self, quiet kids, hiding behind excuses that weren't theirs, kids weighed down by labels they never chose. In his talks, Shai didn't sell success as the outcome. He offered process as revolution. He didn't walk on stage in suits or medals. He came wearing his old school t-shirt, as if to say, "I'm one of you," and he was. The stories he shared weren't meteoric rises. They were quiet, daily advances that no one clapped for. He recalled wearing torn shoes and hearing from the very same coach that he didn't have a basketball body. The audience didn't listen in silence out of respect but out of recognition. Because he wasn't speaking to their egos, he was speaking to the souls of those who fight in silence. Videos of his home training sessions, jumping rope with bricks tied to his feet, doing push-ups on the dusty backyard floor, Practicing shots with a deflated ball started going viral, but Shai didn't romanticize the struggle. It wasn't pretty, it was painful, but that's what brought me here. That kind of honesty cut deeper than any prepackaged motivation, because it showed that the greatest stories don't have to be born in perfect places. They're born in determined people. And Shai, even on days when he doubted himself, never stopped trying. Each talk became a seed. In the schools he visited, makeshift courts began to appear, posters with his quotes went up, and most importantly, groups of students began to believe they could try, not because they had better resources, but because they now had a mirror. "I'm not a hero. I'm just proof that you can turn the game around if you keep playing," Shai would say. Teachers teared up, principals asked him to return, and once isolated students became protagonists of new stories. In many communities, even parents started attending practice with their kids, something that had once seemed impossible. But the impact didn't stop with the youth. Shai also began to reach adults, especially those who had given up on dreaming. School janitors, security guards, maintenance workers, people who, upon hearing his voice, remembered their own pasts. After one talk, a 63-year-old man approached him with teary eyes and said, "You reminded me that there's still time." That kind of feedback made Shai realize his role was expanding. He was no longer just a player with an uncommon story. He was becoming a catalyst for quiet transformations, the kind that don't make the news but change lives. By now, invitations came from everywhere: NGOs, vocational schools, churches, corporate events, even juvenile detention centers. And in every setting, the reaction was the same: silence, tears, and a fresh start. Because Shai didn't bring formulas, he brought vulnerability. He didn't promise success. He revealed the cost of consistency. And in today's fast-paced, image-obsessed world, that was nearly revolutionary. He spoke of discipline the way others speak of love, of resilience like a whispered secret, and of purpose like an offered key. "What drives you must be stronger than what hurts you," he'd say. And right there, new stories would often begin. With time, Shai began to record his journey in a personal journal, not to boast, but to remember where he came from. In every entry, he'd jot down the name of someone who moved him, a phrase from a student that made him reflect, or a question that kept echoing in his mind. One day, he wrote, "Today, a boy told me he'd been waiting for someone like me to believe that he could too." These notes became both reflection and fuel, because despite the growing recognition, he knew his mission was only beginning. Eventually, Shai realized that inspiring wasn't enough. He needed to structure. That's when the idea came to turn his talks into ongoing projects. He created a mentorship methodology with volunteer coaches, leadership workshops, and emotional support groups. He didn't want the emotion of his speeches to fade over time. He wanted it to become a movement, and it did. Some of the young people who heard him in the early days were now leading new groups. The stories began multiplying like ripples in a pond, a virtuous cycle of resilience, belonging, and concrete action. And the most beautiful part? In every city he visited, Shai was also transformed. He began to learn new accents, new realities, new limits. He saw firsthand what it meant to live on 5 rays a day, or to choose between eating and training. He saw fear in the eyes of kids unsure if they'd survive the month due to violence. He saw the beauty of communities that shared the little they had, and the pride of families who celebrated each win like a World Cup. And all of that, little by little, shaped the man Shai was becoming. He finally understood that teaching was just as transformative as playing, that every conversation, every moment of listening, every word of encouragement were invisible plays in a much greater game. And maybe the greatest of all, the game of life, the one where everyone has a role but few recognize their value. That's why Shai decided to keep going, not as a star, but as a bridge, as someone once judged by his body, now remembered for his soul. Someone who understood that the bricks of the past aren't meant to block your path, but to build it, because in the end, the greatest stories aren't just made of victories, they're made of purpose. Years went by, and with time, many things changed, except the essence. The skinny boy once mocked in the school hallways and overlooked in tryouts was now seen on arena jumbotrons. His name was announced with excitement, the crowd roared at every point, and the jersey no longer looked too big for his slender frame. But deep down, Shai never let success disconnect him from his roots. Because he knew, the most important victory wasn't on the scoreboard, It was in the purpose. Shai achieved what many deemed impossible. Not by luck and certainly not by miracle. He got there through silent training, relentless discipline, and a heart that wore the scars of exclusion like invisible medals. And maybe that's why, even with a signed contract, sponsors on his jersey, and invitations to interviews, he never forgot where he came from. Because there are stories that hurt so deeply we make a silent vow. No one else will go through what I did. And it was with that vow that he created something far greater than any trophy. An institute. The name wasn't random. It was a cry of revolt turned into a manifesto. A calm yet powerful answer to the silent prejudice that haunts the backstage of sports. The kind that judges by body, by weight, by the ideal profile. At the No One Measures Talent by a Scale Institute, the goal wasn't to create perfect athletes, but to shape courageous human beings. People who could lose without losing themselves. People who understood that a no today might be the push they need for tomorrow's yes. Shai was deeply involved in everything. He wasn't just the face of the campaign. He was a mentor, a coach, a friend. He sat on the floor with the students, watched the practices, and listened to every outburst as someone who knows how much unhealed silence can paralyze a soul. He would say, "Here, no one is a bench warmer in life. Everyone is the starter of their own story." And anyone who heard it could feel it came from someone who had truly lived the pain of being unseen. At the Institute, mornings began with a talking circle. They didn't just talk about tactics or technique. They talked about life, about respect, about learning how to lose, about how to deal with comparison, pressure, and the fear of not being enough. Shai made sure to repeat, "You might be the smallest on the court, but no one can stop you from being the biggest in effort." It wasn't just motivation, it was testimony. And when practice began, there was no luxury, no cutting-edge equipment. But what you saw was commitment, sweat, boys and girls running with eyes shining, because they knew they were finally being seen. And when someone made a mistake, they weren't ridiculed, they were encouraged. Because in that space, failure was part of the process. It was a safe place to grow, to fall, and to rise. Just like every great story should be. The first results started to show. Kids once dismissed began winning regional tournaments. It wasn't just about technique, it was about attitude, mindset, believing that the world isn't divided between strong and weak, but between those who try and those who give up. And at the Institute, giving up was not an option, because every day Shai reminded them, "You're not here to prove anything to others. You're here to prove something to yourself." But maybe the most moving result of the project wasn't in medals, but in parents' eyes. Mothers who used to see their children sad for not being picked, now cried watching them step onto the court with confidence. Fathers who once felt guilty for not affording a club now proudly said, "My kid's in Shai's Institute." That year, that's the kind of victory that doesn't show up in rankings but transforms generations. The gym where it all happened was given a symbolic name, Court of Overcoming. A simple space, but filled with meaning. Every brick seemed to shout, "No one is invisible here." Shai had a huge phrase painted on the wall. "Ignored talent is not lost talent. It's talent waiting for a chance." And everyone who walked in felt something different. It was as if the place carried an energy whispering, "You belong." And the most beautiful part? Seeing Shai himself in uniform sweeping the court with the students after practice, not out of necessity, but out of humility, because he knew that every gesture was a lesson. And there's no greater teaching than watching someone who made it to the top remember the ground where they started. So whenever a student complained about being tired or wanted to quit, he would smile and say, "I wanted to quit too, but I kept going, because my story needed a different ending." Shai could have moved on with his career and left the past behind. He could have looked only ahead like so many do. But he realized that his greatest role in the world wasn't just to play. It was to give back what the world almost took from him, hope. And so, his story became fuel for many others. He didn't save lives in the literal sense, but he saved dreams. And sometimes that's even more urgent. Today, former students returned to visit, to share their victories, to say that place was their turning point. Some became teachers, others professional athletes, and some started their own social projects. But they all share something in common: the memory of being seen, valued, and empowered by someone who chose to turn pain into purpose. This story isn't about basketball. It's about purpose, about what you do with what was done to you, about not repeating the wounds that hurt you, but building bridges so others don't fall into the same holes. Shai understood that early on. That's why his legacy doesn't fit in a trophy. It fits in every student who stands up even when no one believes in them and says, "I'm going to try one more time." And now that you've walked with me through every step of this story, from the first look of disdain to the moment of triumph, tell me honestly, how many times have you found yourself outside the court, believing you weren't good enough to be inside? How many times did you wear the uniform of your dreams only to let someone else's harsh words tear your confidence apart? This isn't just the journey of a skinny boy rejected at a basketball tryout. It's the mirror of so many stories life insists on repeating. And maybe, just maybe, it's also yours. Have you ever stopped to think about how many talents were buried alive out of fear of seeming ridiculous? How many dreams died before they were even born because someone, with a mocking laugh or cutting remark, said it was too big for you? The truth is harsh. The world won't always give you the chance you deserve, but it will always be watching, waiting to see what you'll do about it. And that's exactly when the greatest stories are born, when someone refuses to be a background character in their own plot. It's easier to stay on the bench. It's easier to believe you weren't made for this, that the game isn't for you. But let me ask, how many stories are you going to shelve just because you're afraid to get hurt trying? Look within. Listen to that silence that speaks louder than 1,000 outside voices. What is it telling you? Maybe it's time to stop asking for permission to be who you are. Maybe you don't need more external proof, just internal courage. Because in the end, the only approval that really matters is your own. Do you know how many talented people never shined because they waited for applause before effort? Too many. And you know what they all share? Regret. Not for failing, but for never trying with everything they had. And if there's one thing I've learned from so many stories like Shai's, and maybe even yours, it's that failure hurts, but omission eats you alive. What if is one of the most painful phrases in life, and you don't deserve to carry that. Do you really think the great names in history got there because they were accepted from the start? Of course not. Most were doubted, rejected, ridiculed, but they kept going. They decided to build their stories brick by brick, even if no one was around to clap, because they understood something powerful. The stage only exists for those who don't quit during rehearsal. And the big question is, are you going to keep living as if you're on pause? Keep walking like you're waiting for some divine permission to finally stand up? Or will you choose, right now, to flip that switch and start writing a new story? Yours. Real, imperfect, but absolutely yours. You can keep sitting in the stands, applauding other people's victories and counting the losses you never tried to avoid. Or you can rise right now. And I don't mean physically, I mean rising from within. Owning your identity, your strength, your dreams that the world might not yet see but that exist, and are begging to be born. Because the world needs to see what you carry inside. Your silent battle, your daily resilience, your talent hidden under layers of doubt and insecurity. All of that is the raw material of the greatest stories. And no, it's not about winning the game in the end. It's about having the courage to step onto the court, even knowing you might get knocked down. It's about getting up after the fall with dignity. It's about honoring your own journey, even if no one's watching. Because when you do that, you don't just inspire yourself, you light the way for others who are also lost in the dark. So tell me, honestly, how long will you let other people's judgments define who you are? How long will you let others' laughter speak louder than your own voice? Enough. It's time to change the game, to turn contempt into motivation, to rewrite your narrative with ink made of truth, courage, and persistence. Because if you don't do it, who will? And if any of this made sense to you, if some part of this story made you stop, reflect, or even feel something, then I invite you, subscribe to this channel right now, not for the numbers, but because this space is made for you, for people like you, people who are tired of seeing the world ruled by those who shout the loudest, while those with true value remain silent. Turn on the notifications, not so you don't miss a video, but so you don't miss the chance to discover each week a new story that might be a mirror, a compass, or a spark in your life. Because here, we don't tell stories just to tell them. We tell them to transform. And you deserve to be part of that transformation. In the end, you have two choices. Keep watching other people transform, or decide to be the next. After all, no one was born to be a footnote. You were born to be the main chapter, so what's the next paragraph in your story?